Hey guys, welcome back. In the previous video, we went over measuring and setting up the action or height of your strings based on fretted playing. And I put a link to that in the description below. But of course, a lot of folks love playing slide on cigar box guitar or mixing slide in fretted playing. So in this video, I'm going to focus on optimizing your setup and action for playing slide or mostly slide with some fretting around it. Now playing slide can be tricky enough, whether on a 3 or 4 string cigar box guitar or 6 strings, especially for beginners. You're trying to avoid unwanted noise on the fingerboard, put the right amount of pressure on the strings, keep the slide right over the fret and not in between, and get a nice smooth vibrato. There's no substitute for putting in the time to develop your technique. But as I've gone back and forth between being drawn to slide and then find myself drifting away from it again and again, I realized that the way the strings were set up was making it an uphill battle. So over time, I've paid attention to those challenges while playing and focused on solving them in my building. I think the 2 biggest challenges are not knocking your slide against the edge of the fingerboard or frets, and getting all the strings to note clearly across the fingerboard. And these are things that we can manage in building, or most of the time in the setup. So today we're going to look at choosing string gauges, because that goes a long way to solving both of those issues, and setting your string action specifically for slide, with an exciting science experiment at the end, so stay tuned. Now it's easy to go down the rabbit hole with string gauges, but I already did that for you. So we're just going to look at some basics here, and I'll put links in the description to the most useful resources I found online, including a really clear reference guide to open tunings and a string gauge calculator. I also made a thorough reference guide in PDF format recommending optimal string sets for both fretted and slide playing, and you can see how to get that in the description below. So why are we starting with string gauge and not height? Well, no matter what height you set your strings, remember you're also adding the weight of the slide against them and constantly controlling the pressure of the slide. That means we want the tension of the strings to stand up to that pressure, so your playing doesn't feel squishy and you don't constantly change intonation while varying pressure on the slide. So right off the bat, heavier gauge strings and higher tension are going to help a lot with playing slide guitar. Generally, we use open tunings with CBGs. If you're new to this, open tuning means you tune the open strings to a major chord, like G or E or D or others, so that when you bar the strings with your finger at any fret or over the fret with the slide, you play a major chord. Of course, with the slide, that makes getting to the notes you want a lot easier than with standard E tuning. It also means you're going to be tuning certain strings up or down from standard tuning, which means tightening or loosening the strings, and that's going to change the tension on the strings and your guitar, especially the neck. Let's take a look. Aaron over at guitargearfinder.com has some quality information on open tunings, like this really helpful chart comparing common open tunings to standard E tuning. The numbers next to the notes refer to the octave range. Remember that guitars have up to 3 octaves of any note. But the important thing here is the change in tension as you tune those notes up and down. The white notes are standard tension, the orange are at lower than standard tension, and the blue are higher tension. You can see that with most open tunings, you're tuning strings down, so you're lowering the tension. That means we need to increase the gauge of those strings to come back up to tension. So let's start by looking at an average gauge 6-string set for fretted playing, then compare this to slide playing. And keep in mind that any brand names you see are just for reference to work in line with the calculator more easily. You can choose whatever brand you prefer as long as the material, construction, and gauges are the same as the ones referenced. And I like to use the middle 4 strings because they're at the heart of the open tuning range. Probably the most common tuning for cigar box guitar is open G, so that means tuning the bottom A string down to G. But you see the string tension drops 3 pounds when you tune down to G. So this is why I compensate with a heavier gauge for that string to keep even tension across the neck, which is healthier for the guitar overall and gives a more consistent playing feel on all of the strings. In fact, we're seeing more and more string companies introducing balanced tension sets for these reasons. Now, like I said before, for slide playing, going up to a heavier gauge increases the tension of the strings and holds up better under the pressure of the slide. But notice I also shift to more wound strings in the slide set. For my fretted builds, I like to go with 2 plain or unwound strings in the top or treble strings and 2 wound strings on the bottom or bass side. This gives you a balanced tone and feel with more ability to bend strings. But if I'm building specifically for slide, I'll use 1 plain string on the top and wound strings for the rest, because these have more surface contact with the slide, which gives a lot fuller tone. You get those nice crying melody notes with a lot of growl under them. Just to make it really clear, look at 3 different open tunings with the same gauge strings and see what happens to the tension of the strings across the neck of your guitar if you don't compensate the gauges. So I put together a guide to good compensated gauges for playing slide in open A, C, D, E, and G, and you can see how to get that in the description below. Or you can use the link to the string gauge calculator and dial in whatever set you want. And finally, don't forget that scale length also changes string tension. For example, here's a comparison of the same string set in 3 different common scale lengths. Whatever tuning or gauge you use, the most important thing to remember when setting up your guitar this way, or especially building one, is that you'll have to move the saddle position back from the original scale measurement. I talked about this in another video on setting intonation, but basically, scale length is measured from the top E string, and the other strings move back from there, with the G string depending on whether it's plain or wound, because of the pitch and increasing diameters of the strings. So if you take away the top and bottom E strings, leaving the middle 4 strings, you see that your top string saddle is a little behind that point, and the other strings will move farther back as you use heavier gauges with wider diameters. With movable or floating bridges, this normally isn't a problem as long as you have enough distance to the tailpiece or wherever you attach the strings. But with hardtail bridges, you need to plan for that ahead of time and move the bridge back about 3/16 of an inch with lighter gauge strings and about 1/4 inch or 1 centimeter for heavier gauges. Exactly how much the saddle moves depends on a lot of things, including material and actual construction of the string. But this will get you comfortably in range where you can dial in the distance by ear without maxing out the saddles in either direction. Finally, of course, you also have to be careful when you increase string tension. Remember, those strings are pulling from opposite ends to the middle, so you're putting more and more forward pull, which risks a forward bow in the neck. Now, some folks might say, so what? If it's for slide, who cares? But this bow doesn't just increase the distance between the strings in the middle of the neck, it also changes intonation reference for all the frets. So make sure you're confident in the strength and stability of the neck, its join to the body, and the strength of the connection of the bridge to the body. I make my necks with at least 3 boards, opposing the grain direction for maximum stability. Then I embed a carbon fiber rod in them, so I know these necks aren't going anywhere under any tension. Okay, well, getting the gauges and tension sorted for slide by itself will help a lot of folks who maybe play everything on one guitar and don't want to change the height. And that's fine if you want to develop your technique around that. But raising the action even another 32nd of an inch will definitely give you more control, and that amount won't affect your fretting much, especially down at the lower frets. Now, if you're building 100% dedicated for slide, or you're going for a dobro feel, you don't really need physical frets at all. You can paint, marker, or even wood burn them on, or just cut the slots but not fill them, or you can use wood inlay for a really classy look. But if you do want the option for fretted playing, I suggest going with low profile frets, which have a crown height, the height of the fret above the fingerboard surface, of 0.031 inches, that's 0.79 millimeters, or 0.037 inches, that's 0.94 millimeters, depending on what's available. And whether you're building from scratch or modifying an already fretted guitar, you might also want to raise the action at the nut. You can do this by cutting the string slots higher on a new, taller nut, shimming the existing nut, making sure the slot is deep enough to hold it, or epoxying it to the shim, using a larger diameter bolt, or if you're using a 0 fret, go with a super jumbo sized fret. This is the tallest crown height fret made, with a crown height of 0.058 inches or 1.47 millimeters, and of course low profile frets down the rest of the neck. Of course, this will make it almost impossible to play fretted notes, at least in tune, but it will give you smooth slide action all the way up the neck. So whether you raise the action a 32nd or a 16th or whatever, what's more important is how you set the height. And this is where I had a big aha discovery. Most references for string action talk about measuring from the top or crown of the 12th fret to the underside of each string. But when you play slide like this, notice what happens. You hear those outer two strings noting clear and true, but the middle two strings aren't clear, or they're almost completely dead, unless you push the slide down a little more on those. And when you think about setting the height evenly across the bottom surface of the strings, you realize that the wider diameter wound strings are standing up higher over the smaller diameter unwound or plain strings. Now with fretted playing, this isn't a big deal because we're subconsciously adjusting finger pressure to adapt for this. Even when we're barring or partially barring, our index finger is pliable, so we're making the same subconscious adjustment to the pressure. But a slide isn't pliable. It's a rigid planar surface. So of course the string surfaces that are closer to it are going to dominate. And guess what? Those are the outer strings, and especially the bottom bass string. So we're having to constantly adjust pressure with the slide to note the middle strings cleanly, even by micro amounts, but we're still doing it. And like I said, we want the guitar to work for us. So when setting your action for slide, try setting the string heights evenly across the top surface of the strings. This made a world of difference in tone and control for me. There are a couple ways to do this, but just like with any guitar, start with the outer top and bottom strings, then raise the middle strings up until they make the same contact against the slide. You can do this while playing, but the downside is it means fiddling back and forth with the wrench, and then playing, and the wrench. Or you can do this neat science experiment. I like to call it the string seismometer. So for this, you need a piece of bone or plastic or hard wood. The most important thing is that it's rigid and perfectly flat and even across the length. You lay it across the strings, somewhere near the middle of the fingerboard. In this case, we can put it across the 12th fret, middle of the scale. And you pick strings from bottom to top. Watch what happens. Do the next one up, next one up, and the top string. So you can see that the bottom and top strings are kicking that piece right off with the vibration, but the middle two strings barely make contact with it, so there's not as much reaction. So we can take our wrench and we can start raising up those middle two strings until we get the same reaction and kick that piece off of the strings. Now we're getting there. Remember, you want to count your turns, make sure that they're equal, keep those saddles nice and even. And so on, until we're kicking it off just as much as the top and bottom strings. Of course, remember you'll need to go back and retune your strings as you raise that height up. So that's about it for this video. I hope I made it all clear enough, and I hope it gives you some useful tips that help you develop your slide playing and make it even more fun. If you thought it was helpful and you'd consider leaving a tip, I left my PayPal link in the description below. I really appreciate any amount, and it helps me keep putting in the time and effort to make these tutorials. So until the next one, please look after each other, and thanks for watching. Bye.
Ouch!